The applause hadn't even died down. My name was still glowing in gold on the ballroom screen, floating above the words Strategic Excellence Award, when Greg Holloway, the CEO, took the stage with a smile too polished to be real. "Let's give one final round of applause to Helena Vaughn," he said, raising a glass. "The architect behind 3 of the most historic partnerships in Wexley Global's history." The crowd stood. I stood. My fingers gripped the cold, crystal award. It had my name etched into it, deep and permanent, just like I thought my place in this company was. Greg glanced at me, then back at the crowd. "And tonight," he continued, pausing for effect, "we not only celebrate Helena, we also say farewell." The room stuttered. Laughter flickered around the edges, the way it does when people think it's a joke but aren't quite sure. He didn't blink. "Effective immediately, Helena will be leaving Wexley Global as part of our new leadership realignment." I didn't move. I couldn't. From the front row, someone gasped. Another dropped a fork. One of the HR directors mouthed something. Maybe, "Is this real?" But no one stopped the music. And then it happened. The screen behind me shifted. My name disappeared. A new video played. Soft piano, corporate clips. A woman appeared, smiling, shaking hands, laughing with Greg. The words on the screen read, "Meet our new head of strategic partnerships." I stared. The woman in the video was Catherine Lee, a mid-level manager from our Chicago office, friendly, eager, utterly unqualified. I had mentored her for years. The audience went silent. No explanation, no warning. Just a pre-recorded tribute playing over my shoulder, like I had never existed. And I was still standing there, holding the award. Greg raised his glass again. "Here's to bold transitions," he said. Then he walked off stage, leaving me alone in the spotlight, literally. That's when it hit me. This wasn't clumsy, it wasn't sudden. It was planned. The tribute, the timing, the smirk he gave as he stepped off the stage. I wasn't being honored. I was being erased, beautifully, publicly, and without a single word of protest from anyone in the room. That was the night I realized applause doesn't always mean respect. Sometimes it means they're glad you're finally gone. I didn't cry when I got off the stage. I didn't storm out, slam a door, or throw the award in Greg's smug face, though every muscle in my body wanted to. I just smiled, the kind of smile you wear when you know the room is watching and you refuse to let them see you bleed. They say betrayal is a knife in the back. But this was a glass of wine in one hand and a knife to the throat, served with a smile in front of 400 people. I walked off that stage as slowly as I had walked onto it, but my mind was racing, not with grief. Not yet. Just questions. Cold, calculated questions. Why now? Why like that? I knew Greg Holloway was threatened by me the moment he arrived. 6 months ago, Wexley's board brought him in to modernize leadership. Young, well-dressed, polished like a press release. He said all the right things in meetings, but watched me like a chess player watches the queen on the board. At first, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I even welcomed him, invited him to strategy lunches, included him in the halberd briefings. But within weeks, he started pulling me from meetings I used to run. Halberd's account planning, suddenly reassigned. The North Star pitch, delayed, and then held without me. Even our annual summit, where I'd been keynote for 3 years straight, was handed to someone else. They called it restructuring. I called it erasure. Still, I pushed through. I closed Halberd, then North Star, and then, against all odds, Adair, our white whale. I brought in $480 million in new partnerships in just under 1 quarter. That kind of growth doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen without leverage, instinct, and trust. And I had all 3. Greg smiled through every press interview like he'd done it all himself. But now, backstage, with the lights fading behind me. That smile made sense. I stepped into the hallway, away from the clinking glasses and fading applause, and pulled out my phone. I needed to check my calendar for tomorrow. Client follow-ups, contract finalizations. Instead, I found a new message. Subject, system deactivation notification, timestamp, 2 days ago. Dear Helena, as per executive directive, your Wexley global email, calendar, and internal systems access have been formally revoked as of 6:30 a.m. 2 days prior to this message, this action is part of your upcoming transition and will remain in effect moving forward. 2 days ago, they had deactivated me before they ever handed me that award, before the ballroom lights dimmed, before the fake gratitude, before the staged applause. I was already gone. I stared at the screen, a heat building in my chest so sharp it felt like acid. Not sadness, not confusion, fury. Because this wasn't a last-minute decision. This had been orchestrated, planned down to the second. My access cut, my replacement filmed, the screen cues timed, all of it designed to make it look clean, celebratory. Greg had never intended to keep me. He just needed my name on the contracts, my reputation to close the deals, and then cut me out before I got too loud, too influential, too recognized. That was the moment the betrayal burned. Not just because he used me, because I let him. The chaos outside was deafening. But inside me, there was only quiet, not peace, not yet. But something sharper, calmer, like standing in the center of a storm you built yourself. I sat alone on the edge of my hotel bed that night, award still untouched in its velvet box beside me, and replayed the entire evening in my mind. The smirks, the screen, the rehearsed applause, Greg's voice echoing in my ears. Here's to bold transitions. What he didn't realize was that I had already built mine. The first seed had been planted nearly a year ago, long before Greg stepped into Wexley Global with his polished suits and shark smile promises. Back then, we were circling Halberd Energy, one of the most elusive clean tech players in the Western market. The deal was massive, fragile, and one misstep away from vanishing entirely. The CFO of Halberd, a woman named Marjorie Lane, was sharp, guarded, and allergic to corporate games. I don't trust companies, she told me over black coffee and an empty conference room. I trust people. And I didn't flinch. So I asked her for a favor, a clause. One line, buried deep in the legal framework, a key person termination option, a condition allowing Halberd to walk away from the entire deal if I, the lead negotiator and strategic liaison, was removed without formal cause. It wasn't personal protection, not entirely. It was ethics. Marjorie agreed without hesitation. If they lose you, we lose interest. We signed the deal 2 weeks later. Wexley's board celebrated. Greg, still the golden outsider back then, smiled for the cameras, but his eyes said something colder. I see your power now. Months later came North Star Logistics. The CEO, Raymond Cho, was more cautious. He had been burned before by shifting corporate teams, revolving doors, vanishing faces. So I made the same proposal, quiet, precise, a clause that granted exit if the named executive, me, was removed unannounced or involuntarily. He blinked, paused, then said, "No one's ever asked me to write in loyalty like that." "Then maybe," I replied. "No one's ever meant it." He signed within the hour. And finally, Adair Trust, the crown jewel. Adair's board was notoriously old school, but its chairwoman, Eleanor Green, was a visionary and a survivor of decades of corporate betrayals. When I presented the clause, she didn't ask a single question. Instead, she simply said, "Greg won't like this." I shrugged. "Then he shouldn't plan to fire me." What I didn't expect? Eleanor smiled, not kindly, but knowingly. Let him. We'll be watching. Each contract had been reviewed by legal, each clause coded in neutral terms. In the event of unplanned transition of designated liaison personnel, client reserves right of review and voluntary contract withdrawal. No fanfare, no red flags, just quiet contingencies tied to one quiet name, Helena Vaughn. Greg signed all three. In his rush to make headlines and spike our stock before the next quarterly board meeting, he didn't even blink at the details. He just wanted the deals to go public, fast. And they did. The media praised him. The board toasted him. And the numbers rose. But power, real power, doesn't live in headlines. It lives in the footnotes. And that night, as I reread each agreement from my hotel room, PDFs saved to a private cloud Greg didn't know existed, I smiled. Not a smile of revenge. Not yet. Just quiet satisfaction. He thought removing me would be clean, simple, silent. But he had unknowingly lit a fuse. And the contracts? They weren't his to keep. I didn't cry when I got home. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. The humiliation still lingered like a wine stain on silk. Impossible to scrub clean. But I'd already given Greg enough power for one night. My tears? He hadn't earned them. The apartment was quiet. The city outside still buzzed, oblivious to the fact that everything I'd built for the last 8 years had just been yanked out from under me, in front of cameras, colleagues, and catered champagne. I slipped off my heels, loosened the clasp of the Crystal Award, and placed it face down on the counter. The plaque still read Strategic Excellence, Helena Vaughn. Funny how recognition always seems to arrive minutes before erasure. Then I walked to my desk, opened the drawer where I kept the other laptop, the one Greg didn't know about, and powered it on. The screen blinked to life, and a single logo pulsed gently in the center. Nova True Partners. Not a placeholder. Not a side project. A fully incorporated consulting firm with federal filings, state business registration, EIN number, and a clean legal slate. The company had been active for just over 6 months, but its soul had been forming much longer than that. In the quiet months after Greg's arrival, when I saw my access shrinking, my influence slipping, I didn't complain. I observed, I documented, and most importantly, I planned. Because I've worked in boardrooms long enough to know that once power starts to shift, you don't ask for your seat back. You build a new table. Nova True wasn't revenge. It was insurance, a contingency, a soft place to land. If, or rather, when, the axe fell. The infrastructure was modest, but airtight. Legal counsel through a former partner at Whitaker and Wells. Tech infrastructure hosted in an independent cloud environment. Client onboarding portal coded and tested. Logo designed by a freelance graphic artist from Austin I'd once helped land a job after a layoff. The only thing missing had been activation, until tonight. I clicked into the Live Status tab and flipped the final switch. Launch public presence. Website, email domain, and onboarding platform all unlocked. Nova True was real, visible, breathing. But it wasn't just the systems that mattered. It was the name. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the word Nova True, and exhaled. 6 months ago, when my lawyer asked what I wanted to name the company, I froze. I didn't want anything corporate, nothing sterile or recycled. I wanted something that meant loyalty, something that would remind me why I started this in the first place, and I found it in the people who had believed in me when my own leadership didn't. No for North Star. VA for Halberd's parent firm. Valencore Energy. True for Adair Trust. Nova True. A quiet tribute to the only 3 names that had ever truly trusted me, not just as a strategist, but as a person, not the company I worked for. Me. I glanced down at my phone. No new messages, not yet. But I knew what was coming. The contracts weren't written in invisible ink. The clauses would trigger automatically the moment my name vanished from Wexley's directory, and the legal departments of Halberd, North Star, and Adair would already be connecting the dots. They weren't just losing a representative, they were losing the reason they signed. Greg hadn't just fired me, he'd tripped every wire I had quietly laid. And now, it was all unfolding exactly as written. But even then, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Because this wasn't a counterattack. It was a transition I had engineered down to the hour. The industry could spin whatever story it wanted. That I was pushed out. That I vanished. That I quit. But the truth would echo quietly. Beneath the surface, Helena Vaughn didn't disappear. She simply changed address. The world was still dark when the call came. I had fallen asleep fully dressed, slumped sideways on my couch, the soft blue glow of my second laptop casting faint shadows on the walls. The screen still showed the Nova True dashboard, freshly live, blinking softly like a heartbeat. The apartment was silent. The streets below were empty. And then, somewhere between sleep and waking, my phone vibrated against the glass table. 4:30 a.m. Exactly. Not a text, not a notification, a direct call. My first instinct was to ignore it. After what I had endured hours earlier, I wasn't ready to face pity, gossip, or worse, sympathy disguised as networking. But then I saw the name on the screen. Eleanor Green. I sat up straight. Adair Trust's chairwoman, one of the most formidable minds in global finance, the kind of woman who didn't waste time on small talk or second chances. I answered on the first ring. "Helena," she said, her voice steady and alert, like she'd been awake for hours. "I assume you're no longer at Wexley." I took a beat. "That's correct." We knew this day would come. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't ask if I was okay. There was no apology, no hand-wringing, just the clarity of someone who had seen power shift before and knew exactly what it looked like when it happened. "We've been watching," she continued. "We read the contracts. We watched the meeting restructures, the reassigned deals. We saw the change in tone when Greg took over. Frankly, we expected them to hold on to you longer, but arrogance makes men sloppy." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Her words did more than comfort me. They confirmed what I had known, but never spoken aloud. Then came the pause, the kind that separates before from after. "We're done with Wexley," Eleanor said. "You already knew that. What I want to know is, are you ready to lead?" My breath caught. I looked around the room, at the laptop still glowing beside me, at the folder of contracts waiting for client review, at the notes I'd written weeks ago preparing for this exact moment, all born from a hunch I hadn't dared say out loud. If they turn on me, will you follow? And here she was, following. "Yes," I said softly. No hesitation, no qualifiers. Just the answer I had built everything for. "Yes." A brief silence followed, but this time, it wasn't uncertainty, it was agreement. "I'll have our legal team begin the transition immediately," Eleanor said. "You'll hear from my chief of strategy before 8 o'clock. We want to be your first client, and your anchor." I closed my eyes. Not in disbelief, in relief. All those nights staying late to draft terms, redline contracts, build a business no one knew about. They hadn't been wasted. They'd been seen, respected, and now, honored. "I look forward to working with you," I said, voice steady. "I never doubted you would," she replied. "Welcome back, Helena." The line clicked off, and just like that, the silence returned, but it felt different now. Full, heavy with possibility. I sat there for another minute, staring at the Nova True logo, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself exhale all the way. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't rebellion, it was validation, it was recognition. It was the rarest thing in corporate life, being seen for what you really are. Not just what they used you for. The sun hadn't risen yet. The headlines hadn't changed. But everything else had. And the first domino had just asked me to lead. It was just past noon when I returned to Wexley. The heavy smell of polished wood and stale coffee still clung to the glass walls. The same way it had during my years there, but nothing felt the same now. The building that had once been my battleground now felt like a mausoleum of what could have been, a cold echo of everything I had fought for, everything I had built. I didn't want to go back, but the paperwork needed to be done. They'd asked me to sign a few documents, severance papers, non-compete clauses, forms I wasn't even sure I wanted to read, all the fine print. But more than that, I needed closure. I needed to step through those familiar glass doors once more, to see it for myself, to look at my old office, to walk past the conference room where I'd closed deals that no one thought were possible. I wanted to see the place where it all started, the place where they'd finally torn me down. I pressed the elevator button and waited, the sound of the gears grinding like my own thoughts. The ride up was silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, I stepped out, walking past the rows of empty desks. A few scattered employees lingered at their computers, but no one met my gaze. I didn't expect them to. It was always the quiet ones who noticed, and the silence between us spoke volumes. I moved slowly toward my office, the soft hum of the air conditioning the only sound filling the space. When I reached my door, I felt it before I saw it. The absence. My office door, once adorned with my name in gold letters, was now closed, and in the place of my name, there was a new one. The door was open. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, was seated comfortably behind the desk. She wore a soft blazer, the sleeves rolled up casually, as if she had already claimed this space, already settled in. Her laughter rang through the air as she spoke to someone on the phone, one hand resting on the polished wood. "Oh, yes, I'll handle it. Don't worry about a thing," she said. Her voice was light, carefree, so different from how I had felt, trying to keep everything in control, trying to prove myself every single day. Her nameplate glinted in the sunlight, catching my eye. Eleanor Hurst, a name I didn't recognize, a name that would never mean the same as mine. And yet, there it was, the woman who had taken my place without a word of acknowledgement. I stood there for a few seconds, just looking. My feet felt heavy, as if the weight of my own past was pulling me down. There was a quiet pain in my chest, an ache I couldn't explain. It was the kind of pain that didn't cry out or scream for attention. It was muted, like the ringing of an old bell that no one remembers. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, watching her, watching the way she slid easily into a seat I had once fought for. The laughter that echoed in that office felt so foreign, so wrong. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Instead, there was something else, a quiet grief that settled deep inside me, a grief that didn't have the energy to cry, to rage. No. This grief was different. It was something I had earned, something I had worked for, and something I would have to let go. I felt a strange calmness wrap around me, like a blanket of resignation. It wasn't defeat. It was just the way things were. People come and go. The work you do gets replaced by someone younger, someone more willing to conform. It had been that way since the day I started. As I turned away, I couldn't help but notice the weight of the nameplate still lingering in my mind. Eleanor Hurst would be the one to make all the decisions now, the one who would sit in the chair I had once occupied. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. There was just a lingering ache in my chest that would take time to heal. By the time the email arrived, I was already having lunch, a quiet table by the window, Second floor of a little cafe in Midtown I'd frequented during client offsites. No nameplate, no pretense. Just a view of Lexington Avenue and a plate of lemon-roasted salmon that I didn't taste. My mind was elsewhere, but my posture, relaxed, composed, was exactly how I wanted it. The phone vibrated once, then again, and then a third time, followed by a buzz so long it could only mean one thing. Something was happening. I turned the phone over. 3 messages. One from Wexley's corporate group thread. One from a former colleague I hadn't spoken to in weeks. And one from Marjorie Lane, CFO of Halberd Energy. The subject line on hers read, Clause C-12, Action Executed. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sipped my coffee, took a breath, and waited the full count of 10 seconds, because this wasn't a surprise. It was the next step in a sequence I'd built months ago, one that only triggered if I was removed without cause. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Halberd's legal team had sent a formal contract termination notice, not to Greg, but directly to Chairman Robert Fields, the head of Wexley's board, bypassing the CEO completely. No press leak, no phone call, just a clean, legal withdrawal letter stamped and signed. Due to violation of Clause C-12 pertaining to key personnel termination without cause, Halberd Energy will be terminating all contractual obligations with Wexley Global. Effective immediately, all transition assets will remain on hold until further review. It was a single paragraph, maybe 3 sentences in total, but it was enough to rip $122 million out of Wexley's forecast overnight. I leaned back, phone still resting screen up on the table, and smiled. Not triumphantly, not bitterly, just precisely. This was never about noise, never about revenge. It was about systems, foresight, and planting the right mechanisms in the right places. Greg had underestimated me. He had assumed my silence was submission. My withdrawal was weakness. But what he failed to realize, what they always fail to realize, is that some of us aren't trying to win the next promotion. We're building things they don't even see until they collapse beneath them. Across the city, chaos was blooming. Inside Wexley's headquarters, the legal team would be scrambling. PR would be drafting statements. Greg would be pacing his office, phone in hand, demanding answers to a question he didn't even understand. Because the letter didn't just reference Clause C-12. It named it. Personnel Trust Breach, Clause C-12 invoked. Those words would sting, not because they were dramatic, but because they were surgical, clean, irrefutable. Greg wouldn't be able to spin this as a strategic pivot or a client realignment. This wasn't about market shifts or economic downturn. This was personal. This was about him. And worse, it didn't come through him. The board had been blindsided. That was the part I knew would leave a mark. As I scrolled through the reactions, I saw the ripple effect unfolding in real time. Confused staff messages, executives trying to downplay the impact. One message even mentioned a temporary hiccup in Halberd's transition timeline. They were already lying. I closed the thread. Let them scramble. Let them talk. I had nothing more to say. Across from me, the waiter returned to refill my water. Everything all right, ma'am? I smiled. Better than all right. Because this moment, wasn't about retaliation. It was about recognition. It was the first undeniable crack in the structure that had tried to bury me. The moment the system started to correct itself, without me having to force it, the first domino had fallen, and I still hadn't touched the board. By the next morning, the headlines were starting to circle. Wexley loses major partner Halberd Energy in sudden contract collapse. Internal conflict suspected amid executive shakeups. No comment from CEO Greg Holloway. But I didn't need to read them. I already knew what they'd say. The world was catching up to what I had known for months. Power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it moves in silence. leaving wreckage in its wake without ever raising its voice. It was 10:15 a.m. when the delivery arrived. I was still unpacking boxes in the small corner unit I'd rented in a downtown co-working loft. It wasn't glamorous. The ceiling tiles were exposed. The walls needed paint. And the air conditioning made a sound like a tired saxophone. But it was mine. I had just finished assembling the desk, a simple walnut slab with brushed steel legs, when I noticed the receptionist walking toward me, a large envelope in hand. "Delivery for Ms. Vaughn," she said, handing it over with a curious smile. There was no return address, no note, just a thick, cream-colored envelope with embossed trim and my name handwritten in the center. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, on thick linen paper, North Star's letterhead engraved at the top. To Helena Vaughn, CEO, Nova True Partners. My fingers stopped. My breath did, too. Not Wexley, not former executive, not even consultant. CEO, Nova True Partners. It was already signed, already dated, already formalized. No red lines, no negotiations. Just one sentence at the heart of the document. North Star Logistics requests continuation of contract under original strategic leadership, now operating under Nova True Partners. That was it. No legalese, no back and forth, no caution, just quiet allegiance. They hadn't even asked. They had simply followed. No noise, no permission, just trust. And then I saw the second item in the envelope, a small velvet box. I paused before opening it, unsure what to expect. When I lifted the lid, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was the watch, a brushed gold timepiece I had gifted Raymond Cho, North Star's CEO, at the end of our deal closure dinner last year. I remembered the moment, a private gesture after a complex negotiation. I had chosen the watch intentionally, engraved on the back with the words, "For time well invested." Now, just beneath the clasp, a new engraving had been added in tiny, deliberate script. "You gave us time, now we return it." I sat down slowly, the weight of it all finally pressing against my shoulders. Not heavy, not painful, just full. Like everything I had quietly hoped for was now arriving, not with applause, but with dignity. The satisfaction I felt wasn't sharp or smug. It was quiet, like finishing a difficult book and closing the cover in silence. This wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. I hadn't taken anything by force. I hadn't issued ultimatums or demanded loyalty. I hadn't spoken a single word to North Star since the night I was fired. And yet, here they were, choosing to follow. The silence was what made it beautiful. The fact that there had been no headlines, no press conferences, just a signature, a gesture, a box with a gift I'd forgotten had meaning. Across the city, Greg was likely holding emergency meetings. His team was probably sending desperate emails. PR was no doubt scrambling to control the optics. But me, I was folding the letter and placing it neatly in a drawer beside the Nova True binder. I was slipping the watch back into its velvet box and tucking it next to my laptop. Not to wear it, not yet. Just to remember that sometimes. The most powerful echo comes from the loudest silence. And today, that silence belonged to me. Power doesn't vanish overnight. It shifts, quietly, like gravity turning beneath your feet while you pretend everything is still in place. By the end of the week, Wexley was spinning. I didn't need insider updates. The signals were everywhere. Halberd's termination had already caused a stir. But when North Star's silence became official, the board began calling emergency meetings. I didn't attend. Of course, I wasn't invited. I wasn't part of their narrative anymore. But I knew what they were discussing: missing revenue, fractured client trust, board pressure, and above all, my name. At 6:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. A single new email from a sender I hadn't heard from directly in almost 7 months. Gregory.Holloway@wexleyglobal.com. Subject: Private and confidential. A way forward. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it, sipping my tea, watching the sunlight push through the blinds of my new office. It was a quiet space, nothing lavish, but alive. The Nova True team was still small, still growing, but the energy? It was real, focused, purposeful. I set the tea down and clicked. Helena, I've had time to reflect on recent events, and I'd like to begin with a sincere acknowledgement. The transition we undertook should have been handled differently. I now recognize the extent to which the execution fell short. Wexley Global is facing critical inflection points. You remain a key voice in this industry, and your influence with our former partners is undeniable. We would like to offer you a path back, one that honors your impact and protects your privacy. I'm prepared to discuss the following: a return at executive leadership level, direct reporting line to the board. Not through me, equity participation and voting privileges. Reinstatement of your client portfolio under your discretion. Let's reset the conversation. I believe we are better positioned as allies than adversaries. Greg Holloway, CEO. Wexley Global. It was everything I expected: polished, strategic, and far too late. Greg didn't believe in apologies. He believed in leverage, and the moment he lost it, he tried to repackage my return as a solution to his crisis. Quiet return. Reset the conversation. Better as allies. He wasn't offering an apology. He was negotiating with the person he thought he could erase. But the problem was, I no longer needed to be in the room to be heard. Outside my door, I heard soft footsteps. Talia, my operations lead, walking past with 2 cappuccinos in hand. She paused at the threshold. "You okay?" she asked, glancing at my screen. I turned the laptop slightly, showing her the subject line. Talia's eyes narrowed. "Is that who I think it is?" I nodded once. She let out a low whistle. "That man has some nerve." I smiled faintly, but said nothing. She handed me the second coffee and kept walking. I stared at Greg's email for another minute. I read it again, and then a third time. And then, with no flourish, no ceremony, I opened my settings. I created a new auto-response. This account no longer exists. No need for a reply. No need for anger. Just absence, the kind that speaks louder than outrage. I clicked save, archived the message, closed the laptop. I knew what would happen next. Greg would check his inbox later that morning, refreshing for a response. And instead, he would receive nothing, a blank void where he used to find control. He would forward it to his assistant. Did she see this? He would call the board chair. I reached out in good faith. He would try to spin the silence as indecision, not rejection, but it was rejection. Total, irreversible, deafening rejection. And the beauty of it? I hadn't needed to raise my voice. When I was at Wexley, they trained me to be polite in meetings, prepared in silence, strategic behind the scenes. I had always been the calm in the storm, the anchor in chaos. Now, I had become the storm they couldn't prepare for. They thought cutting me would end my influence, but they were wrong. By the time Greg's email hit my inbox, Nova True Partners had secured 2 new client contracts, hired 3 key team members, and finalized its advisory board, including Eleanor Green from Adair Trust. What Greg failed to see was that the power he tried to control had never belonged to Wexley. It had always been mine. And now, I held it in full. By the following Tuesday morning, the headlines Greg had been working so hard to control slipped through his fingers like sand. He had tried everything: internal meetings with legal, spin calls with select journalists, and even a curated leadership transparency memo sent to the Wexley team about strengthening values in a time of transition. It read like it had been ghostwritten by PR interns with no context and even less sincerity. But no amount of damage control could stop what came next. At 9:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in years. Maya Hensley, senior correspondent, East Coast Business Review. I remembered Maya, sharp as a razor, reputation for precision. She didn't write gossip, she wrote profiles, the kind that reshaped reputations. I hadn't spoken to her since a panel at Columbia years ago where we both sat on a round table about ethical leadership in finance. She asked hard questions, even in casual conversation. So I knew she wasn't calling to catch up. Her message was short. Check the front page, print and digital. We finally followed the breadcrumbs. You should see it before Greg does. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I opened the ECBR site. The headline was already trending. The Quiet Architect, How Helena Vaughn Built Nova True While Still Under Contract at Wexley, and Why It Was Legal All Along. I scrolled slowly, heart steady, breath even. The article began with the familiar retelling, my sudden exit, the client fallout, the silence that followed. But then it pivoted. It detailed a timeline I hadn't shared publicly, because I hadn't needed to. Maya had done the work. Deep work. She'd spoken to my former attorney, to the business registration office, to people I hadn't seen in years. She had mapped out Nova True's founding from 6 months before I was fired, established while I was still actively employed at Wexley. But the story wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about secrets. It was about strategy. She included key statements from legal experts. No contractual clause breached. No intellectual property conflict identified. No evidence of solicitation or financial misrepresentation. It was all above board. Nova True had been built during late nights, on weekends, through conversations held outside of Wexley's walls. The founding documents, system architecture, and vision board had been created entirely on my personal time, with clear legal consultation at every step. And then came the line, one single sentence, buried 2/3 into the article, the line that would set the industry on fire. She didn't break the system, she simply outgrew it. Those 10 words undid years of whisper campaigns, because the truth was now public. I hadn't gone rogue. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I had just planned for the moment I saw coming, the day when Wexley would try to erase me, and I'd built something stronger, smarter, and untouchable in the background. Greg couldn't say I'd breached confidentiality. He couldn't say I'd stolen clients. He couldn't even say I violated a non-compete, because I hadn't signed one. He'd been so focused on controlling image that he'd left his flanks exposed. And now the entire industry knew. Talia burst into my office 5 minutes later, holding her tablet. "Have you seen this?" she asked. Eyes wide. I nodded once. She grinned. "You look calm." "I am," I said, scrolling slowly. "It's not news to me. It's just news to them." Marcus poked his head in behind her. "The investor line just doubled," he said. "And we got a note from Adair. They want permission to quote the article in their annual investor letter." I paused, letting that settle. Not out of surprise, but because of the poetic symmetry of it. This wasn't just a reputation correction. It was vindication delivered in print, the same format where so many had once tried to write me out. "I want no comment," I told them. "No posts, no tweets. Let the article speak for itself." "You sure?" Talia asked. "Absolutely," I said. "Silence did more for us than shouting ever could." They nodded and left the room, closing the door gently behind them. I sat alone for a moment longer, watching the article ripple through LinkedIn, Twitter, and inboxes across the country. The part of me that had once fought so hard to be recognized no longer needed to. The truth had found its way into the light, not because I demanded it, because I deserved it. It didn't make headlines right away. The first signs were quiet. A few missed investor calls, a cryptic memo from the board's chair, a canceled webinar. But those of us who had played this game long enough recognized the symptoms. Wexley Global was spiraling, and Greg Holloway had run out of mirrors to deflect the truth. By the end of the week, the stock had dropped 39%. Analysts began pulling forecasts, clients froze their renewals. Internally, entire teams were ghosting their own management. And then, late Thursday night, Wexley issued a one-line statement. The board of directors has convened a closed executive session regarding urgent leadership matters. No names, no timeline, just that. But we all knew who they meant. I was still in the Nova True office when Talia forwarded the internal memo leaked to Reuters. It was nearly midnight, and the rest of the team had gone home. But I stayed late that night, not because I needed to, but because I could. The freedom to work on my terms had become its own kind of power. Talia's subject line was simple. It's happening. Inside. The leaked document confirmed it. Emergency board meeting. Voting agenda. Executive termination. Gregory Holloway. The meeting was held virtually, off the books, after hours. No investor call, no town hall. Just 10 men and women sitting in front of glowing laptop screens, finally admitting that the man they had anointed to lead had instead led them straight into the shadows. There was no farewell speech, no applause, no exit interview. Greg didn't even speak during the call. He just stared into the camera, jaw clenched, waiting for the count. 7 votes to remove. 3 abstained. None defended him. He signed the release document and logged off without a word. It was the kind of ending no one sees coming, unless you've watched these endings before. Wexley didn't issue a press release. They didn't thank him for his years of service. Stotiti, by morning. His name had been quietly removed from the executive page of their website, replaced with 2 words, interim assigned. Except it wasn't just anyone. It was David Lang, the one man I had introduced to Wexley's finance board over a year ago, back when they were seeking an outside consultant to assess restructuring risk. I had suggested David, a sharp, meticulous analyst with a calm demeanor and an ethical backbone. Greg hadn't wanted him, said he was too academic. The board overrode him. David had stayed quiet ever since, observing, gathering, saying little but always listening. And now he was the one in charge. I don't know if he requested it, or if the board remembered how steady he'd been while Greg spiraled. But it didn't matter, because what mattered was this. The man Greg tried to push out replaced him. Talia came in the next morning with a coffee, and that same look she always had when things broke in our favor. Half amusement, half awe. "Checked the news yet?" she asked. I nodded. "He's gone." She exhaled. "Just like that?" "Just like that." "No press tour? No LinkedIn essay?" "Nothing." She smirked. "Poetic." I didn't gloat. I didn't post. I didn't even bring it up to the team beyond that one conversation. Because some victories aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be felt. Like when the storm finally passes, and all that's left is the hush that follows. I opened my email later that morning and saw a note from David. Subject: "Thank you, Helena. This isn't a formal message, just a personal one. I wanted you to know that I remember the day you recommended me. I also remember how quickly I was dismissed by those who couldn't see past their own reflection. I never forgot it, and neither did the board. If you're open to it, I'd like to schedule time to talk, not for Wexley's sake, but for the industry's. I believe what you're building matters, more than ever." David. I stared at the message for a while, letting it settle, not because I wanted anything from him, but because the arc had completed itself. The man they protected had vanished in silence. The one I had quietly backed was now leading. And me? I wasn't returning. I wasn't rebuilding them. I was building something better, from scratch, from scars, from stillness. And that, more than any headline, was the only closure I needed. The The room was still when I stepped onto the stage. Not quiet. Still. Like the breath before thunder. The energy before a first note. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for attention, but holds it anyway. It had been 6 months since Wexley removed my name from their lobby wall. Today, that name was on the invitation. In bold, unshakable font, Nova True Partners, official public launch. The event wasn't extravagant. We held it in a restored warehouse in Soho, with exposed brick, clean wood floors, and soft amber lighting. Nothing cold, nothing corporate, just clarity. Rows of chairs were filled with industry veterans, investors, former colleagues, clients. Not all were allies, but all were watching. I took the podium without a teleprompter. No printed speech. Just the truth I'd carried in silence for years. "My name is Helena Vaughn," I began. "And I want to start by saying what this isn't." The room held its breath. This is not a rebuke, not retaliation, not a war disguised as innovation. Nova True wasn't built out of anger. It was built out of necessity. I let the words settle, then continued. "We're not here to disrupt. We're here to restore, to reintroduce ethics, clarity, and strategic trust into systems that have forgotten what those things feel like." Still no mention of Wexley, no name dropped, no headline referenced. I didn't need to remind them where I had come from. They already knew. Then I said the only line that truly mattered. "We don't compete, we correct." At that moment, the curtain behind me parted. 3 figures walked out in silence. Marjorie Lane, CFO of Halberd; Raymond Cho, CEO of North Star; Eleanor Green, chair of Adair Trust. They didn't wave, they didn't bow. They simply stood, shoulder to shoulder, behind me. The room erupted. People stood, not all at once, but in waves. Not for show. Out of something deeper. Recognition, respect, relief. Somewhere near the back, I saw a reporter lower her phone mid-recording, tears brimming in her eyes. A partner from a rival firm clapped with both hands, slow and firm, head bowed slightly forward. But I wasn't watching for their reactions. I was watching my team. Talia stood beside the AV booth, her hand gripping Marcus's arm. They both looked at me the way you look at someone who never needed to prove themselves, but did it anyway. Just to remind you how strong silence could be, the final video played on the screen behind us. Simple black background, white serif text, no music. Sometimes they think they're firing you, but really, they're just freeing you. That was it. No logo, no voiceover, no dramatic swell. And that was the moment I felt it. Not victory, not revenge, but release. All those months of quiet preparation, the stolen credit, the whispered betrayals, the closed doors. It all unraveled in that instant. Not with fire, but with clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood tall, for the first time. I didn't feel like I was reclaiming something. I felt like I had finally arrived. Afterward, I stayed to shake hands, answer a few questions, sign a few copies of our impact report. No one asked about Wexley. They didn't need to. That chapter had closed itself. Later, as the lights dimmed and the guests trickled out into the cool Manhattan evening, Talia handed me a glass of sparkling water and said softly, "They tried to erase you." I looked down at the Nova True emblem etched into the glass. "They didn't," I replied. "If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or replaced, remember, sometimes, the most powerful revenge is rebuilding in silence. Like this story? Tap the like button, leave a comment below, and share it with someone who needs this kind of strength today. And if you want more stories like Helena's, real, raw, and resonant, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next chapter, it might be yours. Thank you for watching.